Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some pretty surprising news coming out from the San Jose Sharks camp today, and that is that Ivan Chekhovich has been put onto waivers for the express purpose of buying out his contract so that he can return home to play in the KHL. Obviously, this is kind of coming out of left field. Ivan Chekhovich had been committed to North America over the past few years through juniors, through the AHL, and even through the NHL, in which he got a couple of games this past season, but it seems as though the trial run that he had at the beginning of this year, in October, November, while the NHL was still on delay due to the COVID pandemic, he got a taste of how KHL game was, and considering he did extremely well while there, maybe he decided he just wanted to go back. Let's now first talk about sort of the career trajectory that brought Ivan Chekhovich to this point. He was drafted as a late round pick for the San Jose Sharks a few years ago at the 2017 draft. In the 17-18, his draft plus 1 year, he was okay at the QMJHL level, very close to a point per game player, but at the end of that season, when his junior year concluded, he would actually go over to the AHL, where in a very brief stint of games, just 6 games, he had actually put up 9 points and looked very impressive. At the beginning of the 18-19 season, he'd even get a couple of preseason games with the San Jose Sharks and would look equally as impressive in those, and as such, hopes really raised for this player, for Ivan Chekhovich. Through the junior year, once again returning to QMJHL, no surprise that a draft plus 2 player, so a 19 or 20-year-old player, would actually be able to put up about 100 points, but still nice to see. And then when he would once again return to the AHL for his couple of games, his handful of games at the end of the season, he still looked pretty good, putting up 4 points in those 5 games. And so going into the 1920 season, it was expected to be a big step forward for Ivan Chekhovich. He'd compete for a roster spot and potentially even get one pretty well, but his first full year at the AHL did not really go as planned. Played about 42 games before the season ended up getting delayed and then just canceled in general, and he only actually had 12 points through those 42 games. Obviously much different from those short stint of games he had in the 2 previous AHL seasons. And as such, coming into the 2021, while people were still hopeful that Chekhovich could make a mark for the Sharks team, maybe not as hopeful as they had been previously. And in 2021, he would get a few AHL games here or there where he would look okay, though not fantastic. And in the few NHL games, his first few NHL games of his career, he'd actually look kind of like a liability and wouldn't really be showing off the offensive flair that we knew Chekhovich was capable of, at least at the lower levels of play. But that does bring me to, as I mentioned earlier, that KHL stint before the NHL season had restarted. He went to the KHL on loan, no surprise there, as a Russian player, and these players wanted to keep sort of warmed up for the NHL grind ahead. And he looked very, very good as a KHL rookie. And so as we move on to what is the reason for why the Sharks would be sort of mutually terminating his contract to allow him to go back to the KHL instead of just loaning him there, and so they're giving up his rights. Well, one reason why I could see Chekhovich could want to go back is maybe he's a bit homesick. Maybe the brief stint that he had in the KHL sort of gave him the feeling that he wanted to remain in Russia, where, everyone spoke the same language as him, things like that. Another big reason is, of course, that Doug Wilson has been promoting the fact that he wants the bottom 6 to be very competitive, and that you're going to be in and out of the lineup a lot unless you play really well and can manage to maintain a lineup spot. And maybe Chekhovich, who's in sort of a traffic jam with a bunch of other players, maybe even like 10 other Sharks forwards for just a few roster spots, maybe he just didn't want to be involved in that traffic jam, right? He looks at the NHL and he says, maybe there's a chance I can be a 4th line player for this team that probably won't even make the playoffs this season, or I can be, a top 12 forward for one of these KHL teams that I was already a top 12 forward for just a few months ago. And that just seems like, to him at the very least, a more attractive option. So it is a bit strange that the Sharks, instead of just loaning him over, would mutually terminate his contract. I know the Sharks are right up near the contract limit for a team. You're allowed to have 50 contracts signed, and according to Cap Friendly, at the very least, the Sharks have 51. But then there's some rules that a few of them are kind of exempt if those players go back to junior, so it's a bit complicated in that regard. So they probably could have made it work, but maybe it just wasn't worth the hassle, as Chekhovich, while he was a promising prospect for the San Jose Sharks a couple of years ago, the past couple of years hasn't necessarily shown a ton of promise in development. So while he may have eventually ended up as a solid NHL player, the Sharks prospect pool isn't too worse for wear with his departure. Class dismissed.